All right, so I'm going to get into chapter 2 of René Girard's I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. Chapter is entitled The Cycle of Mimetic Violence. The crowd is still favorable to Jesus when he enters Jerusalem, but it turns suddenly against him, and its hostility becomes so contagious that it spreads to the most diverse individuals. The theme that dominates the narratives of the Passion, especially in the first 3 Gospels, is the uniformity of reactions among those involved. These reactions stem from the prevailing power of the social body, or in other words, mimetic contagion. In the Gospels, all themes lead to the Passion. Scandals play a role too important to escape from this law of convergence. In the Gospels, all themes lead to the Passion. Scandals play a role too important to escape from this law of convergence toward a single victim. Peter is the most spectacular example of mimetic contagion. His love for Jesus is not in question. It is as sincere as it is profound. Yet as soon as the apostle is plunged into the crowd hostile to Jesus, he is unable to avoid imitating its hostility. If the first of the disciples, the rock on which the church will be established, succumbs to the collective pressure, how will the others around Peter, just average people, be able to resist? To indicate that Peter will deny him, Jesus refers expressly to the role of scandal, mimetic conflict, in the apostle's life. The Gospels show him to be the puppet of his own mimetic desire, incapable of resisting pressures that work upon him from moment to moment. Those who look for the causes of Peter's threefold denial only in the temperament of the apostle or in his psychology are on the wrong track, in my opinion. They do not see anything in the episode that goes beyond Peter as an individual.
Here's your water back.
Thanks, buddy. They believe, therefore, that they can make a portrait of the apostle. They attribute to him...
I cleaned the fabric too.
Thanks, buddy.
I cleaned it. Now
Okay, let Daddy finish. Thanks. Close the door, please. They attribute to him a temperament particularly impressionable and impulsive, or owing to other formulas of the same kind. They destroy the typical character of the event and minimize its Christian significance. The main thing, I repeat, cannot be the psychology of the individual named Peter. In succumbing to the violent contagion that does not spare any of the witnesses of the Passion, Peter is not distinguished from any other or of the other disciples in psychological sense. Resorting to a psychological explanation is less innocent than it appears. In refusing the mimetic interpretation and looking for the failure of Peter to purely individual causes, we attempt to demonstrate, unconsciously of course, that in Peter's place, we would have responded differently. We would not have denied Jesus. Jesus reproaches the Pharisees for an older version of the same ploy when he sees them build tombs for the prophets that their fathers killed. The spectacular demonstrations of piety toward the victims of our predecessors frequently conceal a wish to justify ourselves at their expense. Quote, if we have lived in the time of our fathers, the Pharisees say, we would have not have joined them in spilling the blood of the prophets. End quote. The children repeat the crimes of their fathers precisely because they believe they are morally superior to them. This false difference is already the mimetic illusion of modern individualism, which represents the greatest resistance to the mimetic truth that is reenacted again and again in human relations. The paradox is that the resistance itself brings about the reenactment. Pilate himself is also ruled by mimetic contagion. He would prefer to spare Jesus. If the Gospels insist upon this preference, it is not to suggest that the Romans are superior to the Jews, in other words, to allot good and bad points to the persecutors of Jesus. It is rather to underscore the paradox of the sovereign power that surrenders to the crowd and melts into it, as it were, for fear of an encounter with it. The account thus shows once again the omnipotence of mimetic contagion. What motivates Pilate as he hands Jesus over is the fear of riot. He demonstrates political skill, as they say. This is true, no doubt, but why does political skill almost always consist of giving in to violent contagion. Even the two thieves crucified at either side of Jesus are no exception to universal contagion. They too imitate the crowd. Like it, they shout insults at Jesus. The most humiliated persons, the most crushed, behave in the same fashion as the princes of this world. They howl with the wolves. The more one is crucified, the more one burns to participate in the crucifixion of someone more crucified than oneself. From the anthropological aspect, the cross is the moment when 1,000 mimetic conflicts, 1,000 scandals that crash violently into one another during the crisis, converge against Jesus alone. For the contagion that divides, fragments, and decomposes communities is substituted a collective contagion that gathers all those scandalized to act against the single victim who is promoted to the role of universal scandal. The Gospels try to draw our attention to the prodigious power of this contagion, but usually without success in the case of both Christians and their adversaries. This is difficult to perceive. In the joy of being wrong, James Allison calls the mimetic anthropology transcendental. And what this recourse to the notion of transcendence suggests is the difficulty we all have in perceiving what is already revealed in the Gospels. It is necessary to refuse this mimetic anthropology in the name of a given theology. It is necessary to see in the gathering against Jesus the work of God the Father, who, like the divinities of the Iliad, would have humankind to act against his Son in order to exact from him the ransom that they themselves could not provide. To me, this interpretation appears contrary to both the spirit and the letter of the Gospels. There's nothing in the Gospels to suggest that God causes the mob to come together against Jesus. Violent contagion is enough. Those responsible for the passion are the human participants themselves, incapable of resisting the violent contagion that affects them all when a mimetic snowballing comes within their range, or rather when they come within the range of this snowballing and are swept along by it. We don't have to invoke the supernatural to explicate this. The war of all against all that transforms communities into a war of all against one that gathers and unifies them is not limited solely to the case of Jesus. We all soon see other examples of this. To comprehend why and how the contagion that divides and fragments communities can be transformed suddenly into a contagion that gathers and reunites them against a single victim, we have to examine the way mimetic conflicts evolve. Beyond a certain threshold of frustration, those in conflict are no longer content with the objects themselves over which they are fighting, mutually exacerbated by the live obstacle, the scandal that each is henceforth for the other. They become mimetic doubles and forget the object of their quarrel. They turn against each other with rage in their heart. From now on, each sets up upon the other as a mimetic rival. This type of rivalry does not destroy the reciprocity of human relations. Rather, it makes it more complete, in the sense of reprisals, of course, not of peaceful interaction. The more the antagonists desire to become different from each other, the more they become identical. Identity is realized in the hatred of the identical. This is the climactic moment that twins embody, or the enemy brothers of mythology such as Romulus and Remus. It is what I called confrontation of doubles. At first, the antagonists occupy fixed positions at the heart of conflicts, whose relentless character ensures stability, but as they persist, the interplay of scandals transforms them into a mass of interchangeable beings. In this homogeneous mass, the mimetic impulses no longer encounter any obstacle and spread at high speed. This development favors the strangest about faces and the most unexpected regroupings. Scandals initially appear rigid, immovably fixed on a specific antagonist, each forever separated from one another by reciprocal hatred. But at the advanced stages of this development, substitutions come about as antagonists are exchanged. Then scandals become opportunistic. At this point, they are easily drawn to another scandal whose power of mimetic attraction is superior to theirs. In short, scandals may turn away from their original antagonist, from whom they seemed inseparable, in order to adopt the scandal of their neighbors and substitute a new antagonist for the original one. What determines the scandal's power of attraction is the number and prestige of those it succeeds in scandalizing. Little scandals have a tendency to dissolve into larger ones, and the larger ones in turn go on to contaminate one another until the strongest of these absorb the weaker ones. There is a mimetic competition of scandals which continues until the moment when the most polarizing scandal remains alone on the stage. This is when the whole community is mobilized against one and the same individual. In the Passion, this individual is Jesus, which explains why Jesus resorts to the vocabulary of scandal to designate himself as everyone's victim and to designate all those who are polarized against him. He exclaims, quote, "Happy is the one not scandalized by me," end quote. There will be throughout Christian history a tendency of Christians themselves to choose Jesus as an alternative scandal, that is, a tendency to lose themselves and merge into the mob of persecutors. For St. Paul, consequently, the cross is the scandal par excellence. I would observe that the symbolism of the traditional cross, the crossing of the two branches, renders visible the internal contradiction of the scandal. The disciples themselves are no exception to the common law of scandal. When Jesus becomes the universal scandal, they are all influenced in varying degrees by the universal hostility. This is why, a little before the Passion, Jesus speaks to them in the vocabulary of scandal with a special warning to caution them about the failures that await them, to ease their remorse, perhaps at the moment when they will understand the shame of their individual and collective abandonment of Jesus. Quote, "You will all be scandalized because of me," end quote. Jesus' statement does not mean simply that the disciples will be troubled and afflicted by the Passion. When Jesus says something that seems banal, it is necessary to be wary. Here, as elsewhere, we must give the word scandal its strongest meaning, which is mimetic. Jesus warns his disciples that will all succumb more or less to the contagion that seizes the crowd. They will all participate in some extent in the Passion on the side of the persecutors. Scandals between individuals are little streams that flow into the great rivers of collective violence. Or to use another metaphor, we can say that, like a swarm of bees around its queen, the scandals all swarm together around the single victim. The power that welds the scandals together is an intensified contagion. The word scandal gives the impression of being used haphazardly and to designate many different things, but in reality it always has to do with the diverse moments of one and the same mimetic process, or with this process in its totality. The more unbearable their personal scandals become, the more the desire to extinguish them in some huge scandal seizes the scandalized. This phenomenon can be quite clearly in political passions or in the frenzy of scandal that now possesses our globalized world. When a really seductive scandal comes near, the scandalized are irresistibly tempted to profit from it and to gravitate toward it. The condensation of all the separated scandals into one single scandal is the paroxysm of a process that begins with a mimetic desire and its rivalries. These rivalries, as they multiply, create a mimetic crisis, the war of all against all. The resulting violence of all against all would finally annihilate the community if it were not transformed, in the end, into a war of all against one, thanks to which the unity of the community is reestablished. The victim of mimetic snowballing is chosen by the contagion itself. He or she is substituted for all the other victims that the crowd could have chosen if things had happened differently. Substitutions come about spontaneously and visibly as they take advantage of the sound and fury signifying nothing. Macbeth. In the case of Jesus, other factors entered in which keep us from seeing him as a victim of chance in the same sense as most of the victims of this type. Pilate is an administrator experienced enough to understand the role of substitutions in the case he is asked to settle. This is made clear to us by the famous episode of Barabbas. The Roman concern for legality suggests to Pilate that he had best not hand Jesus over. That is, it would be better if he did not give in to the crowd. Yet Pilate understands that this crowd will not be pacified without a victim. That is why he offers it a victim of compensation. He proposes to have Barabbas executed in exchange for Jesus. From Pilate's point of view, Barabbas offers the advantage of being already legally condemned. His execution will not transgress the law. Pilate's principal concern is not to prevent the death of an innocent man, but to limit as much as possible the disorder that threatens to harm his reputation as an administrator in the higher imperial circles. The fact that the crowd rejects Barabbas does not mean in any way that the Gospels accuse the Jewish people as a whole of harboring an undying, relentless hatred for Jesus. Long favorable to Jesus, then hesitant, the crowd is not completely hostile until the climax of the Passion. This variety of attitudes is quite characteristic of crowds in the throes of mimetic contagion. Once the unanimity becomes about, the crowd seizes on the victim who emerges from the process, and it refuses exchange for another victim. The time for substitutions is over, and the moment of violence has sounded. Pilate comprehends this. When he sees that the crowd rejects Barabbas, he immediately hands over Jesus. If we recognize in the crucifixion what is typical, even banal, we can then understand one of the themes of Jesus, which is the resemblance between his own death and the persecution of many prophets before him. Many people now think that if the Gospels report the death of Jesus as similar to that of the prophets, their goal is to stigmatize the Jewish people alone. This is, of course, what medieval anti-Semitism already imagined, because it was based, like all Christian anti-Semitism, on an inability to understand the true nature and eminently typical character of the Passion. 1,000 or more years ago, in an era when Christian influence had not profoundly penetrated our world, this error was more excusable than today. The anti-Semitic interpretations fail to discern the real intention of the Gospels. It is clearly mimetic contagion that explains the hatred of the masses for exceptional persons, such as Jesus and all the prophets. It is not a matter of ethnic or religious identity. The Gospel suggests that a mimetic process of rejection exists in all communities and not only among the Jews. The prophets are the preferential victims of this process, a little like all exceptional persons, individuals who are different. The reasons for exceptional status are diverse. The victims can be those who limp, the disabled, the poor, the disadvantaged, individuals who are mentally retarded, and also great religious figures who are inspired, like Jesus or the Jewish prophets, or now, in our day, great artists or thinkers. All peoples have a tendency to reject, under some pretext or another, the individuals who don't fit their conception of what is normal and acceptable. If we compare the Passion to the narratives of the violence suffered by the prophets, we confirm that in both cases the episodes of violence are definitely either directly collective in character or of collective inspiration. The resemblance of Jesus to the prophets is perfectly real, and we will soon see that these resemblances are not restricted to the victims of collective violence in the Bible. In myths as well, the victims are seen different. So it is necessary to interpret very concretely the statement of Jesus about the analogy between his own death and that of the prophets. To confirm the realistic interpretation that I propose, the Passion must be compared not only to the violence done to the Jewish prophets in the Old Testament, but also to an event reported at length in the Gospels themselves, the execution of the one the Gospels regard as the last of the prophets, John the Baptist. If John the Baptist is a prophet, then to conform to Jesus' teaching, John's violent death must resemble the violent death of Jesus. That is, we should find in John's death the mimetic contagion and other essential features of the Passion. And indeed, they are found there. We easily verify the presence of all the features in the two Gospels that narrate the death of John the Baptist. These are the two oldest ones, Mark and Matthew. Just as the crucifixion, the slaying of John the Baptist is not directly carried out by the crowd, but it is collectively inspired. In both cases, there is a sovereign who is the only one with the authority to issue the decree of death, and who finally decrees it in spite of his personal desire to spare the victim. Pilate on the other hand, Herod on the other. In both cases, the ruler renounces his own desire and orders execution of the victim for mimetic reasons, not being able to withstand a violent crowd. Just as Pilate does not dare to confront the crowd that demands crucifixion, Herod does not dare confront his guests who demand the head of John. In both cases, everything stems from a mimetic crisis. Concerning the prophet, it is the crisis of the marriage of Herod to Herodias. John reproaches Herod for his illegal marriage to the wife of his brother. Herodias desires revenge, but Herod protects John. To force his hand at his birthday banquet, Herodias stirs up the crowd of the guests against her enemy. To whip up the mimetic contagion of this gathering and transform it into a bloody pack, Herodias resorts to the art that the Greeks took to be the most mimetic of all, the most apt at a sacrifice to motivate participants against the victim, dancing. Herodias has her own daughter dance. The dancer, manipulated by her mother, requests Jesus' head as a reward, and the guests unanimously demand the head of John. The resemblances between this narrative and the Passion are remarkable and cannot be attributed to a kind of plagiarism. The two texts are not doubles of each other. Their details are quite different. It is their internal mimetic character that renders them similar, and this is represented in the manner as powerful and original in one case as in the other. Quote, at the anthropological level, therefore, the Passion is typical rather than unique. It illustrates the major event of the gospel anthropology, namely the victimary mechanism that appeases human communities and reestablishes, at least provisionally, their tranquility. What we discover in the Gospels in the death of Jesus as well as the death of John the Baptist is a cyclical process of disorder and reestablishment of order that reaches its high point and ends in a mechanism of victimary unanimity. I am employing the word mechanism to signify the automatic nature of the process and its results, as well as the incomprehension and even the unconscious obedience of the participants. The most interesting biblical texts in relation to the victimary process are those that the Gospels themselves connect to life and death of Jesus, those that recount the life and death of the figure named the servant of Yahweh or the suffering servant. The servant is a great prophet who appears in the part of the book of Isaiah that begins at chapter 40, the part generally attributed to an independent author, 2nd Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah. The passages evoking the life and death of this prophet are sufficiently distinct from those around them that they can be grouped into 4 separate sections that read like 4 grand poems. The songs of the servant of Yahweh, though the beginning of chapter 40, the first chapter of 2nd Isaiah, is not one of those. In certain respects, I think it should be linked to them. A voice cries, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken." It's from Isaiah 43 through 5. In this leveling, this universal flattening, modern exegetes see it an allusion to the construction of a route for Cyrus, the king of Persia, who permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem. This explanation is certainly reasonable but a little flat. The text speaks of flattening that is clear, but it does not speak about it flatly. It presents flattening as a subject so grand and impressive that to limit its scope to the construction of a great highway, even for the greatest of all monarchs, seems to me too narrow a view of it. One of the themes of 2nd Isaiah is the end of the Babylonian exile, which happily for the Jews was effected by the famous Edict of Cyrus. But other themes are interwoven with that of the return, particularly the theme of the servant of Yahweh. Rather than construction work undertaken with a predetermined goal, the text I quoted is reminiscent of a geological erosion, and I think it is necessary to see there an image of those mimetic crises whose essential feature is the loss of differences, the transformation of individuals into doubles whose perpetual conflict destroys culture. The text assimilates this process to the collapsing of mountains and the filling of valleys in a mountainous region. Just as the rocks are transformed into sand, so the people are transformed into an amorphous mass incapable of understanding, quote, the voice crying in the wilderness. Yet they are always ready to eat away at the heights and to fill up the depths in order to remain at the surfaces of all things to reject greatness and truth. As troubling as this leveling of differences may be, this overwhelming victory of the superficial and the uniform, the prophet invokes it because of the great transformation for which it paradoxically prepares the way, a decisive manifestation of Yahweh. Quote, "And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." This epiphany here prophesies is evidently realized 12 chapters further on in the collective murder that ends the crisis, the murder of the suffering servant. In spite of his kindness and of his love of others, the servant is not loved by his own people, and in the fourth and last song, he dies at the hands of a historical crowd that mobs against him. He is the victim of a true lynching. To understand 2nd Isaiah properly, I think it is necessary to trace a great circular arc that emerges suddenly from the original flattening, from the violent undifferentiation, and that comes down in chapters 52 and 53 in the narrative of the violent death of the servant. This circular arc reconnects, in short, the description of the mimetic crisis of the chief consequence of this crisis, the lynching of a single victim. The death, the murder of the great prophet, rejected by his people, is the equivalent of the passion of the Gospels. As in the Gospels, the collective lynching of the prophet and the revelation of Yahweh make up one and the same event. Once we apprehend the structure of crisis and collective lynching in 2nd Isaiah, we understand also that it constitutes, just as in the life and death of Jesus in the Gospels, what I call a mimetic cycle. The initial proliferation of scandals leads sooner or later into the acute crisis, at the climax of which unanimous violence is set off against the single victim, the victim finally selected by the entire community. This event reestablishes the former order or establishes a new one out of the old. Then the new order itself is destined someday to enter into crisis, and so on. I have like 4% battery, so I have 2 paragraphs left. I'm going to try to get through it. As in all mimetic cycles, the total sequence of events is a divine epiphany, a manifestation of Yahweh. The mimetic cycle is represented in 2nd Isaiah with all the splendor characteristic of the great prophetic texts. Like all mimetic cycles, this one resembles those that precede and follow it by its dynamism and its fundamental structure. At the same time, of course, it includes all sorts of features that belong only to it and that we need to not enumerate. The proof that the same sequence is indeed found in the life and death of Christ, as the 4 gospel writers saw it, is that we encounter in the 4 gospels a description of the mimetic crisis that is literally the same as the description in 2nd Isaiah. The description constitutes the heart of what John the Baptist prophesies concerning Jesus, to remind the audience of this chapter of Isaiah, to have them think of what description of crisis and that announcement of the divine epiphany is the same thing as prophesizing Jesus. It is to announce that the life and death of Jesus will be similar to the life and death of the prophet of former times. It is to allude to what I call a new mimetic cycle, a new eruption of disorder culminating in the unanimous mimetic war of all against one. John the Baptist is identified with the voice crying out in the wilderness, and his prophetic proclamation is entirely summarized in the quotation of chapter 40 of Isaiah. What the prophet intends to prophecy may be summarized as follows, quote, "Once more we find ourselves in a great crisis, and it will end with the collective execution of a new envoy of God, Jesus. Yahweh will use his violent death as the occasion of a new and supreme revelation." Thanks for listening.